Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in history. Today we'll go to the Appalachian Mountains' darkest places, where the fog hides secrets that time has never been able to erase. If you're watching from this part of the world, please let us know in the comments where you are following this investigation from. This video is not real. It was made just for fun. There is no connection between this and real people, living or dead. In the heart of Kentucky, where mountains rise like guardians of forgotten stories, there is a name that locals don't like to say after dark: Abigail Hensley. According to Harlan County records, she turned 49 in 1897, but her life seemed to go against all known timelines. There aren't many records about her because they were burned on purpose or lost in strange fires that destroyed city records over the years. In the late 1800s, federal law didn't have much of an effect on the Appalachian region. Deep valleys and thick forests kept people in isolated communities from talking to each other. People who traveled often went missing, but there was a pattern that outside investigators began to notice. This pattern always led, in some way, to a remote property on the slopes of Pine Mountain. Abigail was not like other people who lived in the mountains. People knew her for taking in travelers and merchants who had to cross the dangerous roads between Virginia and Tennessee. Her log cabin, which was built on a bend in the old wagon road, gave people a place to stay who were afraid to spend the night in the mountains. But this safe place cost more than anyone thought they could afford. It started with a fabric merchant from Lexington who never made it to his destination, then a medicine salesman, and finally an itinerant preacher. Everyone had last been seen going toward that lonely piece of land. Families asked questions, but the answers were always the same. No one had seen or heard anything. The mountains' quietness kept their own safe. Abigail had a strange reputation. She had been a widow for many years and ran a small inn by herself. It seemed to do well for someone who was so far from the main trade routes. She sold food, cooked meals, and made sure the beds were clean. People who lived nearby, but not too close, said she was unusually strong for someone her age, and that her property sometimes smelled strange when the wind blew from a certain direction. A sheriff from a different county looked into the disappearance of 3 men who had left different towns, but were all taking the same route in 1898. They all had money and other valuables with them, and they had all said that Hensley's Inn would be a good place to stop. The sheriff came alone one fall afternoon when the ground was covered in golden leaves and the air was cold and biting like it is in the mountains. What he found on that trip would change how people remember that area forever. At first glance, the cabin looked normal. The wood was dark from age, smoke was slowly coming out of the chimney, and chickens were pecking in the yard. Abigail greeted him with the usual mountain people's hospitality, offering him coffee and bread. But there was something hard in her eyes that didn't match the way she acted. The sheriff, who was good at reading people, could feel the weight of that look. It was the look of someone who kept secrets as deep as the valleys around them. He brought up the disappearances in a casual way during their first talk, watching how each person reacted. Abigail stayed calm and said that many people traveled through there, that the mountains were dangerous, and that wild animals and cliffs took their toll. She spoke in a strong, almost robotic way, as if she had said those words over and over again. The sheriff asked if he could look at the property. She thought about it for a second before saying yes, but that was enough time to confirm her suspicions. The heavy padlock on the back barn door kept it shut. Abigail said that was where she kept her winter food, which animals often tried to steal. She finally opened the door when the sheriff told her to. The smell that came out was indescribable, a mix of rotting and something else, something that had been processed. He found personal items like watches, wallets, and clothes that clearly didn't belong to a mountain woman among the barrels and sacks. Then, in a dark corner, he found something that made his blood run cold. Years later, official records of what happened in that barn were lost, but bits and pieces of what people said about it lived on in their letters and diaries. Reports say that the sheriff left that property with a pale face and shaking hands. He rode straight to the nearest town and got a group of men to come back with him. But when they came back 3 days later, the cabin was empty. Abigail had disappeared like smoke in the fog on the mountain. She left behind only signs of a life that seemed to have been carefully planned for a bad reason. The property was searched thoroughly, and more personal items were found buried in different parts of the grounds, some of which were years old. Every new find made the picture of how many travelers had crossed that path and never been seen again more and more disturbing. Investigators were able to find some of the victims' family members through their belongings. A family in Ohio is looking for a loved one who went missing in 1895 after finding a pocket watch with engraved initials. A widow in Tennessee recognized a Bible with notes in the margins. Each item stood for a life that was cut short, a story that ended suddenly in those mountains. No one ever figured out the exact number, but conservative estimates said that at least a dozen people had gone missing in that area. It took months to find Abigail Hensley. They put up posters with her picture in nearby counties, but the Appalachian Mountains were so big and had so many places to hide that they couldn't find her. Some theories said she had helpers who helped her escape through paths that only the natives of that area knew about. Others talked about a bigger network of other isolated inns along trade routes that were running the same kind of scheme. Her past made the case even more interesting. Investigators who looked into it more closely found out that Abigail had moved to that area from another state around 1880. Before that, it was hard to see where she was going. Some papers said that she might have used different names in different places. There were reports of a woman who looked like this one being involved in strange situations in West Virginia years before, but there was never any solid proof. When the locals finally spoke up, they told things they had kept secret out of fear or twisted loyalty. They talked about nights when they heard cries coming from that direction and thought they were just wild animals. They also talked about how Abigail always had money to buy supplies, even though she didn't have a clear source of income other than the inn, which didn't have many guests. They also talked about how strong she was and how she could carry heavy bags by herself that would take 2 men to carry. A former postal worker shared one very disturbing detail. He remembered that Abigail got letters from different cities, and each one had a different name on it. When asked about this once, she said that she handled mail for travelers who used her property as a stopover point. But those letters were never picked up. They just came and went, which made it seem like she might have been using the victims' own identities for something even more evil. In the spring of 1899, an unexpected clue came to light. A rag picker who worked in the mountains to the south said he saw a woman who looked like Abigail in a small village near the North Carolina border. She was using a different name and running a small boarding house for minors. When the police got there to look into it, she had already left, leaving behind only rumors and more questions that weren't answered. Over the next few years, this pattern would happen again and again. Reports of sightings, late investigations, and always the same result. She was ahead of the game. It was like she had a sixth sense for danger, a way to tell what people were going to do before they did it. Or maybe she had informants who told her when investigators were getting close. The mountains protect their own, and Abigail knew how to use that to her advantage. When investigators found a pattern in Abigail Hensley's methods, the mystery of her case became even stranger. She didn't just pick her victims at random. She carefully chose them, almost like a method. They were men who traveled alone and didn't have close family waiting for them, merchants whose routes were unpredictable and always changing, and people who would take months to be searched for if they went missing, if anyone even looked for them at all. A journalist from Louisville decided to look into the case on his own in 1901 because he was interested in the stories going around about the mountain woman. He talked to people who had lived there for a long time for weeks, gathering bits of information that the authorities had missed. A series of articles that caused a stir at the time reported what he found, but many of the details were thought to be too sensational for full publication. The journalist found an interesting pattern in the geography. For more than 20 years, similar disappearances had been reported in at least 5 different states, always in remote mountainous areas, and always involving lodges run by single women. The descriptions were a little different, but there were enough similarities to make it seem like it could be the same person or a group of people working together in the same way. People started to think more and more that Abigail might not have been working alone. There was something in Harlan County's records that had gone unnoticed at first. Before starting her inn, Abigail worked as a cook in different lumber camps. She knew the best times to travel, the trade routes, and the patterns of travelers' movement. It wasn't an accident that they knew this. They had been watching, learning, and planning for years. Every part of her operation showed that she was cold and smart. One thing that really bothered me was how she seemed to be able to control people. People who had stayed at her inn and then escaped being victims said she was a charming woman who could make any tired traveler feel safe and at home. She knew the local stories, knew when to tell a joke, and gave advice on the best ways to get there. She was the best hostess until she wasn't anymore. Different accounts suggested that she started out using subtle methods. She gave her guests drinks that made them fall into a deep sleep. She made these drinks herself using herbs from the mountains and knowledge she may have gotten from the natives or through years of trial and error. If her victims woke up, which they probably did, it was already too late. They were alone, confused, and completely under her control. People in the area around her old house started to deal with the effects of the discovery. People who lived next to Abigail for years were shocked that they hadn't seen anything. Some people said they had suspicions, but the mountain code of silence, respect for others' privacy, and maybe even a natural fear kept everyone quiet. Now that silence felt like a heavy burden of shared guilt. The investigation was broadened to include records of similar hosts in the Appalachian region. What they found was scary. At least 3 other businesses run by single women had been suddenly abandoned in the past few years, leaving behind disturbing evidence. But without arrests or confessions, it was impossible to connect these cases for sure. There was only one thing that was certain. Something much bigger was going on in the shadows of those mountains. A survivor's story came out in 1902. A man said he got away from Abigail when he figured out what she was up to. He told the story of how he got to the inn at nightfall, tired from days of travel. She was overly nice to him and insisted that he eat and sleep, but something about her made him suspicious. Maybe it was the way she kept looking at his things or the way she locked the doors more carefully than usual. He pretended to drink the hot drink she gave him, but he spilled it when she wasn't looking. When she checked on him hours later to see if he was asleep, he still had his eyes closed and was breathing normally. That's when he heard her moving around the cabin, dragging something heavy, the sound of metal hitting wood, and footsteps going down somewhere below the floor. He waited until the noise stopped, then ran out the bedroom window, leaving everything behind. This testimony, which is impossible to fully check, added to the mystery. It made it seem like there was something under the cabin, like a basement or an underground passage, where Abigail hid what she was doing. When investigators went back to the original property to look for it, they saw that the floor had been changed recently, but any evidence had been removed or destroyed before she got away. Some investigators became obsessed with finding Abigail Hensley because they saw her as more than just a criminal. She was a mystery that went against everything they knew about how people act. How could a 49-year-old woman running an operation alone in dangerous territory go so long without getting caught? The answer was in the geography and culture of the Appalachian Mountains. That area was very different from the rest of the world at the start of the 20th century. Communities separated by deep valleys developed their own dialects and unique customs. People in the mountains were wary of federal law because it was seen as an outside force trying to get involved in things that they would rather handle on their own. In this setting, someone as smart as Abigail could do well, going from one group to another that didn't talk to each other and changing her identity when she needed to. One thing that people often forget about her was how well she could read people and situations. Locals who knew her described a woman of sharp intelligence, capable of memorizing minute details of casual conversations. She knew when a traveler was carrying money by the way he held his bag. She knew routes and schedules better than any cartographer. She understood the rhythm of the seasons and how they affected the flow of people on the roads. This information was her most powerful weapon. Bank records from nearby towns showed some interesting transactions. A woman who looked like Abigail made deposits in small amounts that didn't draw attention, and she always used different names. She converted her victims' assets into cash through intermediaries, selling items in distant markets where no one would ask inconvenient questions. It was a sophisticated system that demonstrated long-term planning. When investigators found strange letters between different counties written in code that talked about goods and deliveries in a way that suggested something more than normal business, the idea that she might have had help gained traction. Some of these letters were stopped, but it was never possible to say for sure who wrote them. There were places on the paper that had been burned, as if someone had tried to get rid of evidence but only partially succeeded. In 1903, there was a confirmed sighting. A deputy recognized her at a train station in West Virginia, but she disappeared into the crowd before he could reach her. This incident proved that she was still in the area, moving with surprising boldness despite the hunt. Perhaps she relied too much on her ability to change her appearance, or perhaps she simply had nowhere else to go. The mountains were her territory, and she knew every trail, every hiding place. The psychology behind her actions intrigued scholars of the time. How does someone develop such a capacity for calculated violence? Some speculated about past traumas that might have shaped her personality. Others suggested that she simply saw her victims as resources, not as people. This lack of emotion, along with a high level of intelligence, made for a dangerous mix that went against all known criminal standards. Families of the victims started to work together to get results from the authorities. Some people promised rewards for finding Abigail, but this had effects that no one expected. Inexperienced bounty hunters flooded the mountains, scaring away potential informants and hindering legitimate investigations. There were cases of innocent women being falsely accused simply because they vaguely matched the description or lived in isolation. The media at the time helped turn the case into a myth. Sensationalist newspapers printed dramatic pictures and made up stories that weren't true. This created both public interest and misinformation, making it more difficult to separate fact from fiction. Some articles made her out to be a mountain witch who used magic powers. Others painted her as a victim of circumstances who had been forced into crime out of necessity. The truth, as always, was probably more complex and disturbing than any simplified narrative. Abigail Hensley was a product of her time and place, but she was also something unique. A criminal mind operating with business efficiency in a period where communication between authorities was slow, and records were easily falsified or destroyed. She exploited the weaknesses of a system that was still learning how to deal with organized crime. As the years passed, sightings became rarer. Some people thought she was dead, maybe because of natural causes or because she got hurt on the dangerous trails she knew so well. Others insisted she had simply become better at hiding, adapting to the new realities of a nation that was slowly modernizing. The mountains kept her secrets safe, just like they did for so many others. The winter of 1904 brought an unexpected twist to the investigation. A former associate of Abigail, driven by remorse, or perhaps fear of being implicated, approached the authorities with information that shed new light on the entire operation. He revealed that Abigail was not merely an isolated opportunist, but part of an informal network operating along the Appalachian trade routes. This network had no formal structure but shared information and methods. According to this testimony, there were established communication points. Markings on specific trees, messages left in taverns and small towns, signaling systems that indicated when the authorities were nearby or when new vulnerable travelers were on their way. It wasn't a criminal organization in the traditional sense, but rather sporadic cooperation between individuals who shared similar interests and protected each other through silence. This revelation completely changed the scope of the investigation. They were no longer pursuing just one person, but trying to dismantle an entire culture of predation that had developed in the remote mountain areas. The issue was that this culture was very old and had been around for decades because people didn't trust outside authorities or were cut off from them. Breaking the code of silence would require not only police force but profound social change. Investigators started to figure out where crimes were happening in the Appalachians. They identified at least 8 locations where similar patterns of disappearances had been documented over 30 years. Some of these places were inns, others were taverns. Some were simply isolated properties where travelers were last seen. Each location shared characteristics: extreme isolation, management by solitary individuals, proximity to poorly guarded trade routes. What made Abigail stand out from the rest was that she lived a long time and was successful. While many had been captured or forced to flee after only a few years, she maintained her operation for nearly 2 decades. This suggested not only luck, but exceptional skill in avoiding detection. She knew when it was time to leave, how to hide her tracks, which police were good at their jobs, and which ones she could avoid or trick. A fascinating detail emerged from the financial records. Abigail had invested some of her ill-gotten gains in legitimate properties under false names. Small plots of land in different counties, some commercial structures in remote villages. It was like she was making a web of safe places to hide and ways to make money, getting ready for a time when she would have to completely disappear. This foresight showed that the person had a mind that thought years ahead. People who knew her told stories that made her look different. Some people remembered her as kind and helpful to her neighbors, even giving them food during the coldest winters. Some people said she was cold and calculating, and that she only kept relationships going as long as they were useful. Because of this duality, it was hard to figure out what kind of person she really was. Was it a social mask or real human complexity? A theory that caused a lot of debate came out in 1905. A psychiatrist from an Eastern university who was very interested in the case said that Abigail might have a condition that made it hard for her to feel normal empathy. He said that she thought of other people as things to be used, not as people with their own lives and feelings. This view was very different from what most people thought at the time, when people thought that crime was caused by evil morals or demons. The theory faced opposition, yet it also initiated dialogues regarding the essence of crime and accountability. If someone couldn't feel empathy because of a neurological problem, did that change how responsible they were? The courts weren't ready to handle such complicated philosophical issues. The law only cared about whether someone was guilty or innocent, sane or insane. There wasn't much room for psychological subtleties that modern science was just starting to look into. While educated people in the city argued about it, the search went on in the mountains. They hired experienced trackers who knew the trails as well as Abigail did. They followed leads that didn't go anywhere, talked to locals who didn't want to help, and made maps of places where she might be hiding. It was slow and dangerous work to cross rough terrain in all kinds of weather, always one step behind someone who knew the area better than anyone else. One tracker, who had worked in the area for 30 years, got very close. He found signs that people had recently lived in an abandoned cabin near the Tennessee border, like campfire remains that were still warm and signs of human activity. But when he came back the next day with more troops, the place was empty again. Whoever had been there had left and taken everything with them, leaving only a few signs that they had been there. In 1906, the investigators changed their strategy because they were getting more and more frustrated. The authorities chose to focus on taking down the systems that supported Abigail instead of going after her directly. They started looking into merchants who might be buying stolen goods, financial middlemen who helped her make deals, and people in the area who were too scared or too loyal to speak up about what she was doing. This new method showed a complicated web of unintentional involvement. Over the years, many people had talked to Abigail without really knowing what she was: a blacksmith who sold her tools, a farmer who sometimes traded food, and a seamstress who made custom clothes. Each of these people gave her small pieces of a bigger puzzle that helped her business run smoothly, even though they didn't always know what the whole thing was about. These investigations showed how crime can grow in places where people don't ask questions and look away. People didn't actively support what Abigail was doing. They just didn't want to know. They chose to be blind on purpose as a way to protect themselves and keep living their lives without having to deal with upsetting truths. People who lived in the mountains learned to mind their own business and let others be. A merchant in Louisville finally admitted that over the course of several years, he had bought a lot of valuable things from a woman who looked like Abigail. These things included pocket watches, rings, rare coins, and small musical instruments. He said at first he didn't think anything was wrong, but as time went on, he started to wonder where all the valuable goods were coming from someone who seemed like a simple mountain dweller. But the easy money was more important to him than his conscience. This merchant gave rough dates for the transactions, which helped to make a timeline of Abigail's actions. The data showed that she worked in cycles, with periods of intense activity followed by months of seeming inactivity. This was in line with how people traveled in the mountains during the seasons. More people traveled in the spring and fall, which made these times riskier and more exciting. Because of the harsh winters and hot summers, there was less traffic on the roads, so she had to stay inside or move. By looking at these patterns, investigators could guess where she might show up next. They found a number of properties that fit her operational profile. They were isolated, but not impossible to get to, close to trade routes, and in areas where local governments were weak or corrupt. Some of these places had teams of people quietly waiting for any sign of her presence. At the same time, Abigail's story began to spread beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Articles about the ghost woman of the mountains in big city newspapers made her seem like a mythical figure. This had both good and bad effects. On the one hand, it put more pressure on local authorities to solve the case. On the other hand, it made it harder to tell the truth from the lies. Each retelling added new details, making reality so distorted that the real person became a legend. There was a big breakthrough in August 1907. Police in a small town in southwest Virginia arrested a woman on fraud charges. She tried to sell a set of rare coins by using fake papers that said they were family heirlooms. The coins looked like things that had been stolen from one of Abigail's known victims. When asked, the woman first said she had nothing to do with it. But as the pressure grew, she admitted that she'd gotten the coins from someone else years before. The way she described Abigail Hensley was a perfect match. More importantly, she revealed an important piece of information. Abigail had said that she wanted to move to a place that was even more remote, like the mountains of North Carolina, where the government was almost non-existent and communities lived almost completely independently. After years of searching in vain, it was a real clue. Researchers set up an expedition to that area. It took them weeks to cross deep valleys and steep ridges, stopping in settlements that weren't even on official maps. People who lived in these areas were wary of strangers, especially those who worked for the government. A lot of doors stayed closed, and a lot of questions were met with angry silence. It took more than just determination to get into this isolated world. It also took diplomacy and endless patience. Finally, an old local gave us useful information. He thought back to a woman who had come to the area a few years before and bought a deserted house on the higher slopes. She stayed away from other people and only came out to buy basic supplies now and then. She always paid with cash and never stayed to talk. He said there was something about her that made people not want to ask questions. She had an air of quiet authority and something else that made people instinctively stay away. The property was 2 days away by the most direct trail, and even longer if you wanted to avoid being seen. It was in a place called Devil's Ridge, which is a fittingly creepy name for a place where fog never left the valleys and old trees blocked the sun even at noon. It was the perfect place for someone who wanted to completely leave society behind, a place where the modern world hadn't yet come and might never come. The people looking into it planned to be very careful. They didn't want to scare her off too soon and risk another escape. They hired local guides who knew about secret trails and paths that would let them surround the property without being seen. It took weeks to get ready. They looked at the land, made maps of possible escape routes, and thought about every possible outcome. They were dealing with someone who had been able to avoid being caught for almost 10 years. Underestimating her would have ruined the operation. The team was finally ready at the end of October 1907, when the leaves on the trees turned the mountains red and gold. They left before dawn and moved quietly through the thick forest. The air was very cold, like it is at high altitudes, and their breaths made little clouds of vapor. They thought about every step and avoided every sound. Along with weapons, they also brought legal warrants and chains with them. This time, they were set on not letting her get away. The sun was starting to rise when they got to the clearing where the cabin was. The morning mist made the sun's rays look golden. The building was small and made of logs that had darkened over time. It was hard to see among the trees around it. The chimney let out a slow stream of smoke, which meant that people were there. Finally, the moment they had been waiting for had come. They thought the hunt was almost over. The investigators quietly surrounded the property and set themselves up at every possible escape route. William Crawford, an experienced marshal who was in charge of the operation, watched the cabin for a long time before giving orders. He had chased criminals all over the area during his 20-year career, but he said this case was different. Abigail's determination and ability to always be one step ahead really bothered him. The smoke coming from the chimney was a comforting sign that things were normal, which was very different from how tense things were at the time. Crawford waved his hand, and 3 men moved toward the front door. Others stayed where they were, covering the windows and the back of the property. In the quiet of the morning, the sound of boots crushing dry leaves seemed very loud. The birds that had been singing in the morning stopped all of a sudden, as if they knew something big was about to happen. There was no answer right away when they knocked on the door. Crawford told them to show their authority and told whoever was inside to come out peacefully. The silence that came after was full of potential. It felt like seconds turned into forever. Finally, after what seemed like a long time of thinking, the door slowly opened to reveal a person who would change their understanding of the case forever. The woman who came out of the cabin was at least 60 years old, maybe even older. Deep wrinkles around her eyes showed that she had lived a hard life in the mountains for decades. She wore simple clothes that had seen better days and were always dirty from work, but there was something in her eyes a sharp and calculating intelligence that made Crawford's suspicions even stronger. This was definitely Abigail Hensley, but she looked more worn out than the description said. She didn't fight back or try to run away when they arrested her. She just held out her wrists to the handcuffs with a look of tired acceptance, as if she knew this moment would come and had accepted that it would happen. When she finally spoke, her voice was surprisingly calm and polite. She asked if she could put out the fire and lock her property properly. The request was so normal and boring that the investigators almost forgot who they were holding for a moment. While searching the cabin, they found what looked like a normal life. There were things for the winter, tools for work, and some books that had been used a lot and were worn out. There were no clear signs of crime, like a hiding place full of stolen goods or evidence that could be used against someone. It was like she had finally given up her old life and was trying to live the last years of her life in peace and solitude. But then they found something in a secret space under the floorboards that changed everything. It was a diary with pages and pages of small, careful writing that recorded years of activities in such detail that it would make any researcher shudder. Abigail had written down everything, including dates, names, amounts of money, and descriptions of things. It wasn't clear if it was pride, a need for order, or some mental urge to keep a record of what she did. It was clear that this diary was a full confession and a map of crimes that had happened over the course of more than 20 years. It took 4 days to get back to civilization. Abigail didn't say a word for most of the trip. She rode a horse between armed guards and crossed the same mountains that had been her kingdom for so long. Sometimes she looked at the distant ridges with a look that could be seen as longing or regret. Crawford tried to talk to her a few times because she was curious about what made her act that way, but she just looked away and stayed quiet. When they got to Asheville, North Carolina, a crowd was already waiting for them. Telegraphs and messengers quickly spread the news of the capture. People traveled from distant counties to see the woman about whom so many stories had been told. There were family members of victims there, their faces showing years of unresolved grief. There were curious onlookers, simply fascinated by the notoriety of the case, and there were journalists, many journalists, eager for every detail of a story that would sell newspapers for months. Prosecutors started the long process of building a case against Abigail while she was kept in a specially prepared cell. The diary gave them a lot of proof, but they still needed to back it up with physical proof and testimony. The families of the victims were contacted, and items mentioned in the diary were looked for in pawn shops and private collections. It was a huge puzzle that took months of careful work to solve. During this time, Abigail started to talk, not in formal confessions or displays of regret, but in bits and pieces with guards, and sometimes with Marshal Crawford, who became almost academically interested in her psychology. She talked about the mountains and how she had learned to live on her own after her husband died, leaving her poor in a place that didn't forgive weakness. She talked about the first traveler who came through her land and had more money than she would see in years of honest work. When she talked about that first important moment, her story had no emotion at all. As was common in the mountains, she had offered to host. He had slept in her cabin, trusting that strangers would be nice to him. She had stayed up all night looking at his bag of money and thinking about how much it would change her life. She said that the choice came from a place of cold practicality, not malice. He had something she needed, and the mountains were vast enough to hide secrets. She said things got easier after that first time, not because she liked violence, but because she saw those actions as necessary for survival, just like hunting animals for food. It was a way for her to keep going while still feeling like she was separate from what she did. She didn't think of herself as a monster. She thought of herself as a survivor doing what she had to do in a world where women alone with no resources had no other choice. Crawford didn't like these talks. The way she talked about horrible things with no empathy for the victims made him feel like he was looking into a moral abyss he didn't know existed. He had dealt with murderers before, men who were angry, greedy, or passionate. But Abigail was different. She had made a career out of crime, keeping her emotions in check so that she could keep going year after year without seeming to be mentally troubled. In January 1908, work began on getting ready for the trial. Prosecutors chose to start with 3 cases where the evidence was strongest and save the others for later trials if they were needed. The victims were men whose families had been found and were willing to testify. They also had their belongings found and could be used as physical evidence. It was a planned move to make sure that the first trial ended in a conviction. A local lawyer took on Abigail's defense, but he did it more out of duty than because he believed in her. He would say that she was temporarily insane because years of being alone and having a hard time in the mountains had hurt her mind. It was a weak defense, especially since her diary showed how carefully she had planned everything, but it was almost the only choice she had. No jury would agree with arguments of economic necessity when it came to killing more than one person on purpose. Even though the legal system moved slowly, Abigail still talked to Crawford from time to time. She talked about the mountains with what seemed like real love, saying that she knew every trail, spring, and cave that could keep her safe during storms. The mountains were where she lived, where she fought, and where she worked. She understood them in a way that few others did. She respected their beauty and power, but she also used them for evil. Crawford will always remember something she said during one of those talks. She said that mountains didn't care about the past or the future. They just were. They just were there, not caring about the human drama that was going on their slopes. She said this lack of concern was freeing. It let someone be exactly who they wanted to be, without having to worry about what other people thought or how they would judge them. It was a scary way of thinking, coming from someone who had done horrible things with that freedom. On a cold March morning in 1908, the trial of Abigail Hensley started at the Buncombe County Courthouse. The room was full to the brim, and people were waiting in the hallways and outside the building for any news about what was going on. Journalists from all over the country had come to cover what was already being called the trial of the century in Appalachia. The mood was thick with excitement and a morbid curiosity that could be felt in every whispered conversation. 2 guards brought Abigail into the room. She was wearing a simple dress that had been given to her. She had shackles on her hands, but she walked with surprising grace, keeping her head up and her eyes straight ahead. She didn't look nervous, shake, or avoid the crowd's stares. It was like she was watching her own trial from the outside, with a distant interest. The newspapers would talk about this calmness a lot in the weeks that followed, when their pages would be full of articles about it. The prosecutor was a man named Theodore Blackwell, who was known for being able to make strong arguments and speak well. He had been working on the case for months, going over each diary entry, talking to witnesses, and making connections that would make a strong case for premeditated guilt. In his opening statement, he painted a picture of a woman who had turned traditional mountain hospitality into a deadly trap by taking advantage of the trust of weak travelers and breaking the most important rules of that culture. Blackwell's plan was well thought out. He started by making a timeline that showed how disappearances had happened in a consistent pattern over the years, always close to Abigail's original property. He brought detailed maps that showed the paths the victims had taken, all of which led to that one spot in the mountains. He called witnesses who had last seen the missing men to prove that they were alive and well when they passed through that area, carrying valuable items that Abigail later had. A widow from Cincinnati who had lost her husband 15 years before gave the first testimony that really made a difference. He sold spices and often traveled the Appalachian routes. He just disappeared on one of these trips in 1893. She had been looking for years, spending her savings and hiring private detectives, but nothing worked. Now, his pocket watch, which had his initials on it, was being shown as proof that it was found among the things Abigail wrote about in her diary. The woman cried in the witness box, not just because her husband was dead, but also because she finally had closure after so much painful uncertainty. The prosecution's main piece of evidence was Abigail's diary. Blackwell read aloud some of the entries, which were almost like business records. Dates, amounts of money, descriptions of things, and everything else was recorded with unsettling clarity. There was no emotional language in the entries, and there was no sign of doubt or conflict. They were just records of transactions, as if she were keeping track of sales in a store instead of things that had broken up families and cut lives short. The defense tried to say that the diary could mean different things, like that Abigail was just writing down things she had bought from travelers. But Blackwell quickly tore apart this argument by showing that many of the items on the list had been reported as belonging to missing people, and that the dates in the diary matched up perfectly with the last known sightings of these people. There was no doubt about the link. The circumstantial evidence was so strong that it was almost like a direct confession. Abigail stayed calm during the whole trial. She didn't show any emotion while listening to the testimonies, even when family members of the victims talked about how the disappearances had ruined their lives. Psychologists who watched the trial said that the lack of emotional response was typical of someone who has very little ability to empathize. It was as if she didn't understand the pain she had caused or didn't care. Both of these options were equally disturbing. The defense called only a few witnesses, mostly longtime neighbors who said that Abigail had always been polite and hardworking and had never shown any signs of violence or instability. A doctor from the area testified about the problems that single women in the mountains have to deal with, trying to create a context that would explain, if not justify, her actions. But these arguments didn't seem strong enough to stand up to the prosecution's strong case. The jury, which was made up of 12 men from the area, listened carefully, but their faces showed that they had already made up their minds. On the fourth day of the trial, Abigail did something that surprised everyone. She asked to testify in her own defense, even though her lawyer strongly advised against it. The room went completely quiet when she got on the stand. Everyone wanted to know how she would explain what she did in her own words. What happened next was one of the most amazing things to happen in the history of the courts in that area. A look into a mind that worked on rules that were very different from what most people thought. Abigail spoke in a clear, strong voice while under oath. She didn't deny what the prosecution said. Instead, she explained her actions in terms of a survival philosophy she had developed over decades of living alone. She talked about how she had been left poor after her husband died, and how society didn't really give women in her situation any good options. She talked about the first traveler she met, who had money that came from years of honest work. She said that at that moment she made a conscious choice that her survival was more important than the moral rules that a society that had abandoned her had set. Her story made sense, but it had no moral value. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She asked for people to understand that she had lived by different rules, the rules of the mountains, where strength and cunning decided who lived and who died. She didn't think of herself as a criminal. She thought of herself as a realist who saw an opportunity and took advantage of it without feeling guilty, like civilized society tried to make her feel. It was a defense that didn't accept the laws that judged her as valid. This was a basic rejection of the social contract that kept communities together. Blackwell's questioning was very harsh. He made her face each victim directly, say their names, and admit that they were people with families who loved them and were waiting for them to come home. But Abigail stuck to her philosophical beliefs even when things were very hard. She knew on an intellectual level that these were people, but she didn't seem to be able to feel real remorse for what she had done. To her, they were still ideas, chances she had taken, not people whose lives had been cut short too soon. Blackwell asked her directly if she felt any regret, and after a long pause, she answered with disturbing honesty. She said she wished she hadn't been caught and that she would rather be living peacefully in her mountain cabin. But as for the things she did, no, she didn't feel bad in the way he was suggesting. She had made those choices based on the circumstances at the time, and she would do the same thing again if she were in the same situation. Even the most cynical people who were watching the trial were shocked by the admission. The jury thought about it for less than 3 hours. The foreman read the verdict aloud in a voice that echoed through the quiet room. Guilty on all counts. Abigail didn't change her expression. She just nodded slightly, as if to say that she already knew what would happen. A week later, the sentence would be given, but everyone already knew what it would be. The law at the time said that only one punishment was appropriate for multiple premeditated murders, especially if there were aggravating factors like premeditation and financial gain. Abigail took one last look at the windows that looked out over the distant mountains as she was led out of the room. It was spring, and wildflowers were covering the slopes, making the scenery bright and colorful. She seemed to take in the view and remember it. Later, one of the guards said that she had whispered something at that moment that he couldn't fully understand, but that sounded like a goodbye. The mountains had been her home, her safe place and her kingdom. Now she could only see them from a distance, through iron bars. The trial got a lot of media attention, which led to a lot of arguments all over the country. Some people said that the case showed that society treats widowed women unfairly, which makes them more likely to feel hopeless and make bad decisions. Some people thought Abigail was just plain evil, which is an example of how some people are born without the moral compass that most people have. Psychologists argued about nature versus nurture, asking if circumstances could turn a normal person into a predator, or if she always had that ability waiting for the right time to show itself. A few days after the verdict, Marshal Crawford, who had spent so much time trying to catch her, went to see Abigail in her cell. He was still looking for answers, trying to figure out how the mind could work so differently from the way it normally does. She talked to him honestly, as if she valued his intellectual curiosity more than his moral judgment. She said that people always look for complicated reasons for behaviors they think are strange, but sometimes the truth is simple. She had found a way to stay alive and do well, and she followed that path with the same determination that other people use to do good things. After that last conversation, Crawford was upset in ways he couldn't fully explain. He had caught the criminal and seen justice done, but he didn't feel the satisfaction that usually comes with finishing a hard case. Instead, he had to deal with uncomfortable questions about human nature, the fine line between civilization and savagery, and how many other people might be living by the same rules in remote parts of the country where the law didn't reach very well. On a gray April morning in 1908, when low clouds covered the mountains and a light rain fell on the city, the sentence was read. Judge Harold Morrison had been on the bench for 30 years and had seen a lot of tough cases, but he said this one really got to him. He gave a speech before handing down the sentence that would be printed in newspapers all over the country. In it, he talked about Abigail's crimes and what they showed about people in society. Morrison talked about how the Appalachian Mountains have been a place where federal law didn't always apply. Communities made their own rules that didn't always follow the law. He talked about how hard it was for people to live in extreme isolation, and how the need to survive could make people make desperate choices. But then his voice got stronger, making it clear that no matter how hard things got, Abigail's actions over the years were not justified. The judge pointed out that each act was clearly planned, that she had built an entire operational infrastructure, kept detailed records, and continued year after year without showing any desire to stop or change course. He said that this wasn't a matter of desperate survival. It was a conscious and repeated choice to put her well-being above the lives of other people. It was a basic rejection of the rules that let people live together in society, so the law should have given the harshest punishment possible. Morrison gave her the death penalty by hanging, and the execution was set to take place 6 months after all appeals had been heard. As he said the last words, the room was completely quiet. Abigail listened to her sentence with the same calmness she had shown during the whole trial. She didn't cry or complain. She just nodded slightly, as if she understood that this was the only logical answer to an equation she had started to solve many years ago in the lonely mountains of Kentucky. As is usual in death penalty cases, the defense lawyers quickly filed appeals. They said that she didn't get a fair trial because of all the media attention the case got, and that the jury had been swayed by sensationalist news coverage. They also said that she should have been found insane, meaning that she couldn't tell right from wrong in a way that would make her criminally responsible. But these arguments ran into a huge problem. Abigail's own diary showed that she fully understood what she was doing and had gone to great lengths to avoid being caught. Abigail stayed in a special cell in the county jail while the appeals process went through the courts. She had visitors from time to time, mostly journalists who wanted to talk to her for articles that were getting more and more sensational. Some people saw her as a victim of her circumstances, a woman who society had let down and then turned against it. Others saw her as a natural monster, proof that real evil exists in the world, no matter what the social or economic situation is. A psychiatrist from the University of Virginia got permission to talk to her a lot in order to write a case study about her mental health. For weeks, he held long sessions in which Abigail talked about her life, what drove her, and what she thought was right and wrong. These meetings revealed a complicated picture of someone who was very smart, could plan things very well, but had no emotional empathy at all. She could understand on an intellectual level that what she did caused pain, but this knowledge did not make her feel the right way. The psychiatrist thought that Abigail was an example of a condition that science was just starting to figure out, a brain that was missing or damaged its normal moral structure. She was not insane in the conventional sense. She did not experience delusions or disconnection from reality. Instead, she had a different set of basic values, with self-interest being the most important and not caring about how her actions affected others. It was a disturbing discovery that called into question long-held ideas about free will and criminal responsibility. Abigail asked for paper and a pen while she was in jail. She started writing what she called a full memoir of her life. The authorities let this happen in the hopes that the document would shed more light on cases that had not yet been solved, or make things that were still unclear clearer. Over the course of months, she wrote an amazing manuscript that gave readers an unprecedented look into her mind and methods. It was written with such clarity and detail that it was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. Abigail wrote about her life from the beginning of her marriage to the events that led to her capture in these memoirs. She wrote about how she and her husband, a merchant who wanted to start a successful business on the new trade routes of the Appalachians, had moved to the mountains. She said that he died in an accident a few years later, leaving her broke in a dangerous place. And then, with brutal honesty, she wrote down the first time she made a choice that would change her life forever. According to her account, the first traveler had been almost accidental. He appeared one stormy night seeking shelter. She accommodated him, prepared a meal, and offered him a bed. During the night, unable to sleep due to financial worries that constantly consumed her, she saw his bag overflowing with gold coins. It was at that moment, she wrote, that she realized the futility of honest work compared to the opportunity that fate had placed in her path. The decision came not from emotional impulse, but from a cold calculation of the cost-benefit of different courses of action. After that first incident, she said she was very anxious and thought she would be found at any moment. But weeks went by, then months, and no one came to ask questions. The traveler was a loner with no close family, exactly the type of person who could disappear without prompting an immediate search. This realization was a revelation to her. The mountains were full of such people, individuals in transit without strong ties who would quickly notice their absence. She had accidentally discovered a systemic vulnerability that could be exploited. The memoirs detailed how she then systematized her operation. She studied travel patterns, learned to identify which travelers were vulnerable, and developed methods to ensure she would never leave obvious evidence. She established connections with unscrupulous merchants who would buy stolen goods without asking questions. She made up several identities to use for different transactions. It was a criminal business that ran like a well-oiled machine, with every detail carefully thought out and carried out. What made the manuscript particularly valuable to investigators was its frankness about numbers. Abigail gave estimates of how many victims there had been over the years, but she said that her first diary didn't cover everything, especially from the early years when she wasn't as good at keeping records. The figures she suggested were much higher than investigators had estimated, suggesting that the true extent of her criminal activities might never be fully known. Each number represented a life interrupted, a family destroyed, a future stolen. She also wrote about the practical challenges of maintaining such an operation for so long. There were near-capture moments that required quick thinking and sometimes abrupt relocation. She always had to be on the lookout for threats or opportunities in every person she met. It was a life of constant stress, where letting your guard down even for a second could mean the end of everything. But she talked about this tension in a way that made it sound like it was her most important and active time. One part of the memoirs that was especially interesting was when she thought about morality. Abigail spent a few pages talking about why she didn't feel guilty like other people probably would. She thought that all people acted out of self-interest at their core, but that most people had been taught by society to hide this behind layers of fake morality. She had just taken off those layers and was being brutally honest about why she was doing what she was doing. It was a nihilistic philosophy that said that human life had no value other than what it meant to the person. The guards who kept an eye on her had different ideas about her. Some people thought she was evil personified and stayed away from her as much as possible. Some people were very interested in her and sometimes talked to her about everyday things. Abigail was always polite, never caused any trouble, and followed all of the prison rules to the letter. She was a model prisoner, which made it hard for her to understand how she could act so badly after being found guilty of such terrible crimes. The appeals court turned down all of the defense's appeals in July 1908. They upheld the original conviction and kept the death sentence in place. The execution was moved to September of that same year. When Abigail heard the news, she only asked for one thing: to be able to see the mountains one last time before she died. It was a simple request, but it had a lot of meaning. It showed that even though she was cold and calculating, there was something in the mountains that touched a part of her that was more human. The authorities talked about the request for a long time. There were obviously concerns about security, but there was also the understanding that this might have been the only humanitarian request she had made since being captured. They finally agreed to let her go, but only if she followed strict rules. She would be taken to a high point with a view of the mountains, where she could spend an hour before being taken back to prison to wait for her execution. The trip happened on a clear morning in August. Abigail was chained up and taken by cart to a promontory called Eagle's Rest, where she was treated with the respect that is usually given to convicts. From there, you could see for miles in every direction, taking in the Appalachian Mountains and all their wild beauty. Ridge after ridge rose up to the horizon, covered in thick forests that changed color as the clouds moved and let in sunlight. Abigail stayed quiet for a long time and just stared. The guards stayed a respectful distance away, giving her this last chance to connect with the place that had been her world for so long. Reports later said that she cried for the first time since she was captured. It wasn't tears of regret for what she had done, but tears of sadness for losing the mountains she loved more than anyone else. It was a show of emotion that proved she could feel something deeply, even if it was only for landscapes and not for people. There was a deep silence in Abigail Hensley's last days in prison. She spent hours looking out the small window of her cell and watching the clouds move over the mountains far away. Some people came to talk out of curiosity, while others came to try to figure out the mysteries of such a different mind. She answered with the same polite behavior she had shown throughout the trial, always keeping the emotional distance that was typical of her. The chaplain in prison tried to give Abigail spiritual comfort, but she made it clear that she didn't agree with him. She couldn't see or touch anything that wasn't part of the physical world. Her philosophy was still based on the cold pragmatism that had guided all of her decisions. The chaplain would leave these talks troubled by how sure she was about life and how she didn't look for any deeper meaning in it. When fall came to the mountains and painted the slopes in gold and red, Abigail made one last simple request: to see the mountains one more time. The authorities talked about it a lot, but in the end they all agreed. They took her to a high cliff with a view that went on for miles in every direction, with a lot of guards around her. There, she stood in silence for an hour, taking in the view of the landscape that had been her home for so many years. The guards who were there said that was the only time they saw her cry. She wasn't crying because she was sorry or sad. She was crying because she felt a deep connection to that wild place she loved more than anything. The mountains had been her friend, her safe place, and her home. Now they were there to see her off for the last time. It showed that even though she was cold to people, she could still feel something real for the place that had protected her. The last events happened without any drama. Abigail faced her fate with the same calmness she had shown since she was caught. When the time came, she walked with dignity. There were no dramatic last words or admissions of guilt. She just looked out the window at the mountains one more time and whispered something about how those old ridges would still be there long after everyone there had turned to dust. The authorities wrote about her death in a short official way. There was no big ceremony for her burial. She was buried in a local cemetery with a simple tombstone. Newspapers wrote short articles about the case being closed, but people had already moved on to other things. Abigail Hensley's name slowly faded from people's minds, becoming just another sad story among the many that the mountains held. But in the Appalachian communities, her memory lived on in a different way. People told stories about her on cold nights, and over time, she became more and more like a legendary figure. She became a symbol of the darkness that can exist in lonely places, and a warning about what happens when someone chooses to live completely outside the rules that hold societies together. Every time someone told the stories again, they grew and changed, adding parts that mixed fact and fiction. The homes she had lived in over the years were either abandoned or destroyed. People in the area burned down the original cabin as a way to get rid of the stain it left behind, but the stone foundations stayed, slowly being covered by plants. They were quiet reminders for those who knew where to look. The mountains took these places back and made them part of the landscape again, as if they had never seen anything bad happen to people. The case had effects that went beyond just the one story. It changed how the police kept an eye on remote areas, made it easier for different jurisdictions to talk to each other, and set up rules for looking into missing persons cases. As roads got better and the government got more involved, the Appalachian Mountains slowly became less isolated. The world where someone could work in the shadows for so long was coming to an end. A more connected society was taking its place. Marshall Crawford kept the thoughts he had while talking to Abigail to himself. He looked over them from time to time and used what he learned to come up with better ways to investigate. The things learned from those uncomfortable conversations had a bigger purpose. They helped to make sense of behavior patterns that didn't fit with what was known. It was a way to turn something bad into a tool to stop more bad things from happening. Over time, scholars would rediscover the case as a historical example of how extreme isolation can lead to behaviors that would be impossible in communities where people are together. It would be examined within the framework of boundaries and areas where legal jurisdiction was constrained. The lessons learned would help people understand how geography and social structure affect the chances of good and bad things happening. Few people know the whole story of Abigail Hensley today when they hike the Appalachian Mountains. She has become a little-known figure in the region's history, remembered mostly by a few local historians and scholars who are interested in the darker parts of the past. The mountains are still beautiful and indifferent, holding countless stories in their ancient folds and silently witnessing all the human dramas that have happened over the years. This journey through one of the mountain's most unsettling mysteries reminds us how complicated people are. The choices we make and the values we hold shape not only our own lives, but also the world around us. The story we are going to read today is about what happens when someone decides to cut off all ties with other people and live by a philosophy that puts their own survival above everything else. The Appalachian Mountains are still wild and unassuming, hiding their secrets in the fog that hangs over the deep valleys. How many other stories are buried on those old slopes, waiting for someone who is interested enough to find them? How many secrets are still hidden in the dark corners of the thick woods and empty cabins? These questions keep coming up over and over again. If you liked this look into one of the most interesting and dark parts of history, you might want to subscribe to the channel for more investigations of forgotten mysteries. If this story piqued your interest, please give it a thumbs up and tell us what you think in the comments about how stories change when they take place in remote areas. Until the next time we go through the shadows.